And Alyssa came to me and said, you know, this isn't right. Um, we both know that the meadow extends further than the DEP maps, and we need to come up with a definition that regulators can use that's ecologically based, that is not just um, constricted by technology. What remote sensing can actually achieve. And so that's what started this discussion. And there's a mass seagrass group, which Tay Evans, Jill, myself, and a number of other people have participated in and started this discussion several years ago. And I guess we didn't get to the point of actually putting stuff on paper, which kudos for you guys for doing that, having the courage to put something on paper to start the discussion. But it has implications not just for small peer projects, but under the Clean Water Act, 303D lists, state impaired water lists, all this type of definition has implications for those which have much broader, um, consequences. So I think it's really critical that a group such as this, with experts in this habitat type, provide a definition that regulators, conservationists, state, federal, local officials can all kind of grab onto and use.
Great. Thank you so much, Phil, for giving us a little background there. And hopefully that struck a chord with a lot of the folks that are here in the space, contributing to this idea of how many uses this definition can be helpful for. Even yesterday in the meeting with the Chesapeake program, we talked with one of the regulators that said, yes, this is exactly what's necessary. It's wanted to get out in front of the problems before it's actually materialized into too big of an issue. Tay.
Yeah, hi everyone. Just to add to what Phil said, in the mass seagrass group, we did research what the available definitions were in literature and what other groups were using. Like I think Washington State. There's a couple different, the Army Corps of Engineers definition, and I tried to make sure that those were included in your spreadsheet. So hopefully they're captured. The work we did in Massachusetts is captured in there.
Yes. Thank you for that, Tay. So a couple links that we can put in the chat, and it's linked on the agenda, is this spreadsheet that we're operating off of. We don't foresee that as being a living document, right? It's because it was just the basis. And so people were putting in kind of any definition that we found that might be relevant to this conversation today. And also brief note, if you're just joining us, to make sure you put your name and your affiliation in the chat, just so that we have a record on there. We'd appreciate that. And so to give you an idea, that's kind of the who, what, where, why, how did we get here? And some of the scope and components, you can see the next thing to discuss is what this endorsement and deliverable process looks like. And so what we envisioned, because for it to be a helpful document, we need to make sure that there's a consensus building around the experts here in this space to give us that feedback. And so our vision for that is that we're going to try and get close to what we're comfortable with during this meeting time. And spend a majority of our time in these breakout groups so that you can approach the draft definition from the lens that you select in each one of the breakout rooms. We're kind of hoping that there's a good sort, that people aren't all in one space. And so the approach is really to hone in on some of the factors that we consider important for the definition, and then to worry about like the wordsmithing and some of the number values, and I'm going to talk about that next, are just kind of placeholders.
I will write it down for you.
She'll write it down. And so are just placeholders for this type of conversation, but that's what you're going to kind of get into the weeds in your groups. And so after we come to a general consensus of the majority of people feel pretty comfortable with it, which would not be in today's session, right? This is going to be the follow-up. Then we would have a general consensus statement that then goes out to everybody that the East Coast SAV Collaborative have taken under this task of creating a definition. And this is the panel of people that were consulted and endorsed this as a definition for use by, whatever the purpose is. And so the language around that obviously is what we're working on today. And what we envision happening is today is to get the basics there, the real strong sticking points. And this is where our steering committee comes in. And so if you're a steering committee member, please anticipate that there will be a follow-up meeting where we will take more of those specific tasks or items under consideration. So if you are not a steering committee member, what we want you to do is if there's some residual thoughts that you have, or if you know of someone that is not here today that might have some comments, is to give those to your steering committee member, and then they'll take them into the space when we have that follow-up conversation. How many meetings with steering committee will that take, right? That it's kind of an unknown, but we do look to get this deliverable out by middle of this year as kind of that general timeline. Obviously, the sooner the better, but that's kind of what we're thinking given we all are volunteering our time for that purpose. Are there any questions about kind of what this forward-looking, the process looks like? All right. Seeing none, I do want you to then look at the draft definition. So that was taken from, and I think I should be able to share my screen. That was taken from the submissions on the spreadsheet that we were circulating, had been circulating for quite a while. So that's the draft definition. I kind of gave a sneak preview by sending that out to the list of people attending today in advance so that you could take a read through it. And so it's long, right? It's long and there's multiple components to it. Please, again, consider the numerical values as simply a placeholder for things that might further have a conversation about. When you're in your breakout rooms, your approach is to consider this definition. Is there any bullet point that's lacking? Is there a component to an SAV bed that from the perspective of a regulatory body is not being represented? Or if there's a bullet point there and so that you would want to suggest be added? Or is there a bullet point there that doesn't truly encapsulate some of the struggles that you've encountered in that dynamic that Phil and Tay kind of briefed us on? What parts are missing and what part needs a little bit of tweaking. And then you're going to actively work with the moderator in your breakout room to live edit this document in that space. And really, the utility of this definition comes from all of us contributing and reaching a consensus on, yes, it's actually encapsulating what we want. Doesn't mean, of course, that we can't go revisit it after we've issued it and maybe we encounter some issues or some further suggestions, but this is the starting place. Again, if there are any comments, I say in general. So the idea is we're taking this general draft definition into the breakout rooms and we're going to further pick it apart really and give it a further analysis in those breakout rooms. Given this definition as it is right now, are there any main points that anyone feel needs to be made about this definition before it goes into the breakout rooms where you'll have a more involved and hopefully smaller group to talk about? Phil.
Yeah, two big picture things from this. One, I think we should think about, and I've written something that I will forward, the reason we're doing this, and then also a disclaimer that anything that doesn't meet this definition doesn't mean it's not worthy of conservation or protection. So that's one large point. And the other on persistence, this is again a larger point. Under the Clean Water Act, any SAV that exists and was mapped after 1972 is considered an existing use. It needs to be protected and restored if it's lost. And so the 10 growing seasons may be a state thing, but under federal law, anything post 1972 that's really the time frame we should be looking at.
Think so. And obviously, one of the things that's come up in the steering committee meeting was that not all areas will have 10-year, data set, like those little nuances. Let's not get into the weeds too much on those. And we can add those little caveats without a doubt. But the idea is really to give the guidelines as much as we can. Paul.
The one thing that I wanted to also relate is that so much of this is sort of species dependent. especially with regards to things like what is the edge of the bed compared to, in existence, because certainly Thalassia, Syringodium, they have a very different sort of edge dynamics than Zostra does, as well as Rupia. So I don't know whether we want to have aspects of clarification of what the definition of an SAV bed is, because we're all, working within different systems that may have it. And in some cases, some of them also relate to freshwater species that may be in the coastal zone. So Vallisneria, Pomatagitan, other ones might be there that, how we define it might be more challenging unless we take sort of a species by species approach, which I hate to do, which makes it even more complex for regulators. But it's a very complex thing.
Well, and I think those are the nuances that you can get in. I would suggest maybe joining more the ecological group. Yes, if we get Thalassia here, we should be alarmed, or Syringodium. But in this case, we want to make it so that it's applicable to submerged aquatic vegetation, so fresh to salt. And what does this generally look like? So it's useful for any of the regulators. The species nuances, again, if in the ecological breakout room, that group feels like this definition would not be useful unless we broke it down by species. That certainly they can bring that, you can bring that back to the group when we regroup after the breakout sessions. Jill.
Thanks, Z. Yeah, going through this process in Massachusetts, somewhere we got stuck multiple times was thinking about, like was just mentioned, those tricky edge dynamics and kind of function of a meadow at different densities. And at one point, we came to a definition that was any amount of seagrass whatsoever. So, is a single shoot a bed, or does it have to be surrounded by other single shoots? And these are the sorts of ideas hopefully everyone can take into the breakout rooms and think about that, because we're not being real protective of the resource if we're, only protecting something over 10 or 20% cover. There are entire meadows that are under 10% cover, and they're happily persisting that way. So these are some of the most challenging parts of what we have ahead of us here.
Exactly. And that's where, the numbers are placeholders. If we don't want numbers, if your group, reaches a consensus around the language that makes more sense. Absolutely. Tay.
Yeah, and additionally, what is the definition being used for? Is it, remote sensing to define the edge would be different methods than if you're in the field trying to define the edge. And are you doing it for a regulatory purpose? Are you doing it for some science need? We were measuring mooring scars, and we had how do you define the transition from what's being impacted by the mooring chain, and then what's the meadow that's not impacted. That might be a different edge than when you're delineating it around a dock.
Well, and that's the purpose and the intent behind the 3 breakout rooms, is that your approach as you're looking at this definition is how does it fit for what your purpose might be? So regulatory framework, right? It's going to be completely different than if you're coming in because you're mapping it or asking a scientific based question. And so it could be that you suggest we strike out completely, some of these bullet points, because when it comes down to it, from a regulatory standpoint, these are the actual factors that are most important. And that's, again, certainly an option that you would bring up in that breakout room and then have that dialogue with those other in the space. Like, do you agree? Does it seem like we might simplify? And so I think what I'm hearing from a lot of people is like, and we acknowledged from the steering committee meeting is how will the definition be used? And that's how we came up with those 3 breakout rooms, is it seemed like we could kind of cover all the potential uses with those 3 bins. And I know that some of you might be like, well, I want to be in both bins. We will come back together and kind of have the leads present, okay, here are some of the major points that we felt should be in there or not in there. If it's the 10%, because I know from my experience in my area, this is going to nix most of the important beds, then clearly, that's one that you would reach that consensus to take out. And then what we, in the end, would hope to produce, and this is where I don't know the answer to this until we come back together. Is it one concise, really short definition, and then we have 3 longer ones with like, for regulatory purposes, these are the things that you need to include? Or is it 3 of these longer versions that are tweaked for those specific purposes? And that's where, we'll kick it back to the breakout rooms to make that suggestion or work together. Anne, and then I think, are the breakout rooms ready too? And we'll go there. Anne, go ahead.
Just quickly, I was going to say I might have a little concern if you have different definitions, because especially if there's a definition for resource and definition for regulatory, and the regulatory folks aren't happy with that and they go, or vice versa, it could cause problems.
Well, the goal is that we have one definite, like an ecolot, like a SAV, a definition of what that bed is, but there might be different components to it that are going to be more useful. As a regulatory, you might be looking at something completely different than as a researcher, I'm looking for the definition for these facets. So I think that's where the interplay, the steering committee felt like, okay, by having these 3 bins, we're going to have these perspectives looking at it for those purposes so that it can be the most helpful, given the admittedly wide range of uses for the definition. It's a good point.
Okay.
Thanks, Ann.
Just nice.
Yeah, appreciate that. All right. So awesome. There you go. Breakout rooms are up. How does that work, Jesse? This is assigned to.
It should be, everybody should be able to pick their own room.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, and then so that in the chat, room is 1 is regulatory, 2 is monitoring, 3 is ecological.
Perfect. If you get kicked out, Caitlin will be back in this general space to redirect you, or if you want to go to another one, you can leave and come back, and we'll reconvene as per the agenda.
How do you actually enter the room?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know.
is something supposed to pop up?
It should be once you pick it.
No, but
There's
how do you even
nothing
pick it?
I don't see anything.
Except the chat.
Hold
Okay,
on,
so
but-
if the window hasn't popped up for you to choose a breakout room, if you go to the bottom of your screen, there's a circle with 3 dots and click more, then there's an option for breakout rooms. And then there's a whole list there, or you should have an option. I think it looks a little bit different for me since I'm a host. There we go. I see people opting now.
Remind me again, which one's 1, 2, and 3?
1 is regulatory, 2 monitoring, 3 ecology.
Very good. You're right about that.
Funny. All right. I will join. I'm just waiting to everybody get there.
So Jesse, you're in 3.
Yeah, I'm going. I
in
just
1.
make sure everybody's getting in.
Appreciate
I'm trying
that.
to go to
All
1.
All right.
So I don't see my name on the list. I know I'm in this meeting. Where am I?
All right, I'm gonna go to my room because there's a lot of people there.
That was easy.
Okay. It might just be our group again back here.
Oh.
Well, no, we've got some other folks. Let me see.
Was our breakout recorded? I didn't notice.
I am not sure how it works. I know the overall meeting is being recorded, but I'm not sure if breakouts individually, to be honest, are recorded. Let me check some. All right, we'll see. I would say maybe take this opportunity as a bio break if you need to.
Did you figure out how we could access the document? Was there a link for that? Because I was in Z's meeting before, and there was a link and we were all editing that one document, but it didn't make sense for me to stay on that one in the regulatory group because I think you're having different documents, right? For each group?
Yes.
Okay, so
Yeah.
can I have access to the regulatory one? Somehow?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Let me go in and here, I'll put that in the main. People with access. Anyone with link. Anyone with link. All right. Hopefully that should work. I am going to put it in the chat.
Just really quick while we're hanging out too, I would really support and highlight Phil's earlier comment about being able to distinguish this idea of these regulatory decisions with what we're coming up with here in a definition. I was chatting while we were in there. I had to step away and chat with a contact I had over a fishing game, and they have, you know, regulatory decisions about how they're permitting aquaculture farms. And he basically said they use everything available to them, between mapping, between anecdotal field verification, between historical mapping that goes all the way back to, you know, 2010. I mean, just everything available to them. And we also don't have a formal definition of bed, much for the same reason, because in a lot of cases, they don't want to paint themselves into a corner. In some cases, that's I think it was Randy that mentioned something very similar for Pennsylvania, where it almost might limit your options. So just again, thinking about how we're using these and the you know, in what cases we want to put these into, and it might be where mapping and monitoring and regulatory all sort of have something slightly different because the function is a little bit different.
So, okay, so at first I thought you were advocating for essentially just having one definition for like just one ecological definition, and then letting the regulators do with what they want. But then at the end,
it could be, yeah. I think really thinking through the purpose will be important because I don't think, like, for instance, specifically regulatory, we should just try to fit everything under the sun into it, because in a lot of cases regulators might just say we can't use this. It puts too many restrictions on us for whatever reason. And also, we're not trying to tie it directly to regulatory decisions, because those agencies will be using a lot of different evidence and a lot of different resources to make those decisions.
yeah, okay, I can totally see that. I think, yeah. Now that you're saying that, maybe it would be just beneficial to come up with one simpler definition without trying to spin that definition for regulatory purposes or for monitoring purposes. Because either way, I mean, we kept coming back to the same thing anyway. You know, in the conversation about regulation, we were talking about how it's monitored. You know, and in monitoring, we're talking about, you know, the habitat function of 3 shoots versus, you know, 20% versus 100% dense bed. So it all comes back to the same thing. So maybe we are making it more difficult on ourselves by trying to come up with these separate definitions. What we could do is come up with our one simple, not simple, but one definition. And then as the collaborative, potentially based on that definition, make recommendations for use in a regulatory framework or use in a monitoring framework. Maybe something along those lines. Yeah.
Can you just say that a bed is the presence of SAV?
I sort of took a crack at that at the bottom of our management document, just a single definition without any bullet points.
Oh, good. Oh.
That we could poke some holes in.
At the regulatory definition document, is that what you said?
Yeah.
Yeah. I like that.
Can you guys put that in the chat, since the ecological folks are also here and we don't say your document?
You're back. You're back. Yes.
We're back. You didn't notice my smiling face? Oh my God, Brooke.
All I could see was Trevor's smiling face. He was made on my screen.
What is a patch? Do you
Yeah.
want to add that 30-foot distance thing? Or
And so that's where, you know, that comes back to the, say you want to build a dock and there's 3 shoots of grass there. How much of that space are we protecting? Or do they really, I mean, I don't know a regulatory agency in the world that's going to say you can't put a dock there because of those 3 shoots of grass, but maybe there are some. Not in Chesapeake Bay. But,
They wouldn't. What did they say? You may have to do compensatory mitigation to offset those impacts. So
sorry, will you say that one more time, Randy? You're fuzzy.
Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can now.
My mic's on first now. Hold on a second.
Okay. Thanks, Andy. So Susan said that they reworded seabed, which I appreciate, to substrate to include freshwater. And then Phil added an SAV meadow as a semi-contiguous vegetated area of seafloor, maybe substrate, subaqueous substrate, of any density that is reproductively connected. Do you think the regulatory agencies are gonna know if they're reproductively connected, or is that where we are getting into the distance defined by Washington State?
Yeah, I mean, and that would vary by species. So that definition would allow you to have the flexibility of being species specific.
Yeah, okay. Jesse, you want to come off mute and tell us how things went over in your ecology group?
We went down a lot of different rabbit holes for sure. And I think there were some things that we started by actually taking a step back and talking about patches versus beds, and the fact that they're both functioning and maybe functioning a little bit differently and what becomes a bed versus a patch. We also talked about, even in the basic definition, by vegetated, like we took that step back and we added it to like completes its life history underwater. I mean, like I think it's going to be important maybe to share our documents. There's a lot of changes to that. And we actually, there was even questions about like in the definition, moving to the beginning part, really focusing on ecological services there instead of having it as like they provide a habitat in part of the definition, like actually moving it to the top. But surprisingly, overall, people were pretty happy to have a number within certain parts of the definition, but we want it to be literature based, not just sort of like what's already out there regulatory wise. So making it more about like what, something's actually gone out and measured and said, okay, this is the value. So maybe that's something we can, as like a deliverable to this, and then we can add in addition to the definition and sort of like, here's where we need help. Here's where we need more information. So, folks in this group can get that kind of stuff. They can do these sort of experiments and monitoring or that kind of, maybe that could be like a call to action for some of these topics. But I think there's a lot of folks in my group that really contributed a lot. I'd love for them to kind of say what they think here. So it's not just me chatting.
Well, if anybody else wants to pipe up, feel free. How about I give you a quick rundown of what we did too. And I will say that there are no draft or edited definitions. What I wound up doing is taking notes on various points of the definition that we had drafted, and we concentrated on where's the edge of bed, because that seems like the biggest question. And so we went around in circles on that a little bit. Let me actually look at,
We took that out of our definition. I love this. We were like, we may actually take that out of the definition for ecological, because it's sort of like Joel Audrey made a great point about like ecologically trying to decide you say it's a bed, do we really care the edge? And we were like, can't wait to hear what the monitoring folks say about that.
Yeah, yeah. So that I bet the monitoring folks don't like that. And the regulatory folks are going to have the same issue because they need a defined area where they need to not worry about regulating a resource. So I think Randy wanted to say something earlier, and then he had issues, but he said he's back. Do you want to
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
pipe up on any of that, Randy? Yes, I can hear you now.
That's fine. Yeah, I was going to mention about the dock, and you said about how it's unlikely to get, or for a state to refuse a permit for, 3 shoots or whatever. And you're right, we likely wouldn't deny a permit for that unless there's some other, reason, threatened endangered species or whatever. But we may and would likely ask for additional compensatory mitigation to offset those impacts.
Okay. So that is very impressive. So you all are actively doing SAV mitigation in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, and the dock may, just for this specific example, there may be shading impacts too that would warrant mitigation, depending on the design of the dock itself.
Nice. Do you do SAV plantings, or are you doing out-of-kind mitigation, or like monetary mitigation in lieu fees or anything like that?
Plantings.
Plantings. Nice.
Yes.
Okay.
Which has its own difficulties as far as success rate, but
yeah,
that's what we've been doing.
Great. That's awesome to hear. That's good to know. We are starting to do that in Chesapeake Bay as well, and it's tricky, but it's going well so far. But unfortunately, docks, we have very little regulations for docks and SAV in Chesapeake Bay. It's kind of disturbing, but that's really good to hear for you all. I think, yeah, we have much. We would never. I mean, I would, but Maryland Department of the Environment would never recommend mitigation for, a couple blades of grass, unfortunately. But maybe we can craft this definition to convince them to do that. And then Jesse, I totally interrupted anybody else from your group that might have wanted to speak up. So if anybody from Jesse's group wants to pipe in.
I can say what I said about the solo colonizing plants that we find, and whether when there's a very few number of plants, but they might be potential for self-restoration. I feel like the importance of those plants as far as future restoration should be included, even though they are less dense perhaps, or fewer in number or smaller in size.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. We kind of talked about that as well in the framework of SAV habitat versus potential SAV habitat, and and since we were coming at it from the regulatory perspective, how to go about protecting that potential habitat effectively, and so I mentioned in Chesapeake Bay we look at a 5-year composite most generally for our regulatory purposes, and if SAV was present there in any density in any of the last 5 years as mapped by aerial surveys, then that is considered SAV habitat. Once you get to the 6-year mark, if it hasn't been there in 5 years, and it's not there in year 6, then you're free to impact the area and do whatever you need to do, and you're approved for a general license. But
I just wanted to, I don't know, I wanted to chime in with something else that we discussed in the ecological group, but did you have more things you wanted to say?
No, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, we also had some discussion about simplifying the definition, which it looks like you guys did too, based on Jill's, what Jill put in the chat. We weren't entirely sure how to go about that, but one question that did come up is the way the definition is currently written, does an SAV bed have to check every single one of those bullet points in order to be an SAV bed? Or is there the possibility that if it checks enough of them, but not all of them, we could call it an SAV bed? So if it's not persistent, but it's dense, or has low cover, but provides an important habitat in situations like that.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We did talk about potentially, so yes, simplifying and not necessarily having separate definitions like we had maybe thought we would for ecology, monitoring, and regulatory. Because, you know, when we were talking about, and I think you all were back in the room when we were talking about this earlier, just it all comes back to the ecological definitions. So having a regulatory definition and a monitoring definition, I think we need a certain level of detail included in the definition to make sure that a bed edge can be defined. And if the ecology group got rid of the bed edge, I don't know.
We talked about doing
We might argue it. But
yeah, so it's still, there's a lot, mostly like the document that we'll all, I mean, anybody can see it, right? It's in the shared folders, but
yeah, we did have trouble having access. I think I needed to go in and allow access for some folks.
okay. Well, we can, I mean, there's a lot of notes on that and sort of shared. And so there was not a consensus on like, here's our final definition, but there was a lot of, I think, about moving forward in trends. And so I think the biggest thing was the top, like the submerged aquatic vegetation bed is defined as a continuous patchy area of the substrate that is vegetated with rooted vascular plants that complete their entire life cycle underwater, which provides critical ecosystem environmental services. That, and I can try to copy it. It's a lot of like edits in that. So I can try to maybe copy it and put it in a clean version in the chat. But that, I mean, we still kept the smaller components to get into more detail, and that's what we're still trying to figure out how to get all that working together.
Yeah, okay. I like that. Yeah, I definitely wanted to get rid of that seafloor. Subaquatic substrate.
I'm just gonna end her. I think she'll get mad if I just end her breakout room.
I can hear her talking still. Z is at my house and she's in the guest room running her portion of the meeting. So I can hear her talking, but I can also pop in and tell her to wrap it up. Maybe I'll do that.
I won't end it.
Sorry. Don't yank her out yet. I'll be right back.
Do people have insight on defining habitat, monitoring habitat?
What was the habitat question? Because I will share that I think one of the things we discussed was that we should really be distinguishing between the definition of a bed separate from eelgrass habitat.
Just said to come get you. Any other time you wouldn't be able to come get me, but she's just, you know.
Yeah, because you ignore my text.
I said we were, hey, you know, I can't help it that the monitoring room was pretty amazing.
All right. My guys were good. We just had a harder question than you. Just kidding.
You what? Kidding. Oh, we had a harder question.
Just kidding.
All right. Where are we at? So reporting out, do you want, I can share the work that we went up to. I don't know what you guys were talking about.
So go ahead, do yours, and then we can do a summary of the other two.
Okay. So we attacked this pretty hard. We had a great group of people focused on monitoring. So the goal really was, if we're out in the field or doing aerial work, to assess if the bed's there or not, what are the parameters that would be necessary to say, yes, that's a bed, it's not a bed. And so some things that we tweaked in the beginning, obviously that it's the benthos, not the seafloor. We had a conversation about sometimes there are species that aren't actually rooted or they're a bit more drift, but we stuck with rooted. So we like the first component. And then we went through each of the bullet points. And so we were saying to keep the top three. The bottom three we felt could be used as almost a second tier part of a definition, because it's so dependent on the species, on your environment. and your use. Persistence in particular, quite a few folks, we weren't really quite in consensus or consolidated on the persistence bullet point, but I'm going to go through the three that we were solid on. The first is vegetation cover. And so we felt that the minimum should be 5% vegetative cover and determined by generally just ground truthing or photo recognizable signatures and aerial imagery to allow for either of those components. But 5% was our, I would say, or what we're proposing there. Secondarily, size. In discussing the size, we wanted to really call out patches as well. So size, we said a minimum mapping unit would be 50 meters squared. And so what that means is those places that are less than 50 meters, what are we doing with those? And how do we actually account for those? Are they just bare? We just don't say it's not there. And so what we did is say patches, if they're less than the 50 meter squared occurring within 50 meters of other patches, we would combine into like a polygon. So a polygon to say that it's combined into one bed rather than a bunch of separate patches that wouldn't have been included. We do acknowledge it's like a placeholder for what makes sense for the distance, and that would be kind of getting tweaked by anyone from the ecological group. Do we think 50 meters, patches that are adjacent, there's good flow between, that you got some seed source, you've got animal usage, whatever that looks like. So we wanted to account for patches in that way. And then the last component is that we looked at edges. So a transition zone, since we identified a minimum of 5% cover, then we clearly needed to tweak that value. And so the transition is, it goes from less than 5%, so like bare, to greater than 5%. And we have eliminated any discussion of density or shoot counts, because again, that gets into the weeds, into the grasses with each of the species really having such a different component, a different value based on, taller species, larger species versus a small species. So those are the three that we put forth as being key to defining a bed for monitoring. And then we kind of did a brief conversation about the last statement, but that mapping and surveying would happen annually, ideally during an active growing season. It's not really reflected elsewhere in our definition about the frequency that this monitoring should be happening. Whether that is key to defining an SAV bed, debatable, but given that frequently the question might be, okay, here's the parameters to define a bed, how often do I need to go make sure that I've updated the map for that? So anyone from my crew of people, I'll stop sharing. Great group again. Thank you all for the time. Is there anyone did I miss anything or misconstrue anything? Awesome.
I think
Thumbs
you
up all
nailed it.
around. Thank you. That's what we got.
Do you want to go next, Jesse, or you want me to go?
I'll go.
Okay.
This is okay. So we have a lot of a messier sheet than y'all. The biggest thing we did, I know, so I was like, okay, we have a lot of notes, and I think part of this is because there's such a variety of, SAV is such a broad encompassing topic. So the biggest thing we did was back the definition out a little bit, and we really wanted to make sure we were including both when the meadows were submerged or intertidal. So SAV bed is defined as a continuous or patchy area of the substrate that is vegetated with rooted vascular plants that complete their entire life cycle underwater. And then we decided it was important to move ecosystem services up to the top part of the definition. And so here we're, again, it's obviously not finalized, but at least alludes to what they are. And we thought maybe we could even list them here. Also, I think one way to keep in mind is how we were looking at this definition would be that maybe the bed or patch, which we also thought was important to bring into the conversation, but that the bed or patch wouldn't necessarily have to meet all of these criteria, that it could meet like some of the criteria. And that's something that we could possibly discuss. So none of these are finalized. Man, you guys were good. None of these are finalized. And so the vegetation cover here, we did add, the idea, we liked the idea of having numbers. We just really want to go back and make sure that these numbers are supported by the literature and not just through the regulatory documents, but also sort of like go back to anybody asking that. And Z, one of the things I was saying about earlier before y'all's group came in was that maybe from this document, in addition to definitions, we can have sort of like a list of things where we really need a lot more information on these to be able to formally define it. So getting some information on like what is the minimum cover for some of these functions could be, maybe it's already out there, we need to compile it kind of thing. Or maybe it's something we can all focus on with our research programs or that kind of thing. So anyway, for vegetative cover, we kept cover. In size, there was some conversation about, do we even need the edge? And so that's really kind of how I'm caught on the side. And so there was also talk about how size and edge work together. So a lot of it was trying to figure out ways to integrate some of these components into, so that would make sense when they were both looked at both independently and also together. And so that's what some of the language here for the size was changed to match that as well. We added a bunch of ecosystem services together to, but again, we're thinking maybe moving this bullet from the body of it up to the top. And so rather than having to go through and list a minimum things that SAV beds have to do, we can sort of say like, here's things that they do. And this is, we're doing a couple of these that works out to be an SAV Meadow. And then we were kind of getting to the point where we're circling a little bit, but this idea of like, for the ecological definition, do we really need to have both substrate and physical environment? So a lot of these have highlights because we're trying to figure out, do we actually need to have that in the definition or not? And so I think what we can do is kind of work together to kind of reduce some of this and then bring it out to the whole larger group. And then one of the big things that got brought up a bunch of times was that we need to also focus on these transitional areas. So things that don't necessarily meet the definition of a larger meadow or larger bed should also be included in some part of the definition. And so this could be maybe signifying areas that's starting to colonize or starting to expand into new areas that wouldn't meet the minimum definition of a bed, but may actually, we could argue, be more important to protect with these regulations than established beds. And so trying to either, and we thought maybe we could include that in the definition as sort of either a caveat at the end or at the beginning so people don't miss it. But just having that alluded to in the definition was something that was key. And I know I've missed a lot, so if Jamie or Susan or other folks from the group want to add anything else that you think is key. No. So we have a lot of editing to think back on. But we wanted, it was kind of kept going to the point where, like, in our conversations, we were like, well, what does the monitoring group say, or what does the regulatory group say, or like trying to have that together before we could stop sort of circling on some of these topics. So this has been helpful.
So we sort of did the same thing. We kept coming back to what the ecology group would say. And I think, I'll go through our page, but we didn't wind up really editing as so much just taking notes. And I think, so one of the things that I took out of it towards the end of the conversation was that really maybe we don't need 3 definitions because there was a lot of conversation about not defining a bed for regulatory purposes and projecting what decisions might be made based on the bed definition. I think we came to the conclusion that we just need to define a bed and let the regulatory agencies use that information. But then we could potentially include recommendations on how to interpret the definition based on whether you need it for monitoring or for regulatory decision making, if that makes sense. So we're picturing a document with a definition, and then here are some recommendations on how to use this. But let me share, and you can share. Okay, can you all see that screen? Okay, so there was some question of whether to define SAV bed as SAV habitat or SAV potential habitat. Anne suggested using SAV habitat rather than SAV bed because it implied that, and feel free to jump in if I'm not getting this right, Anne, but it took out some of the implications around very sparse beds or very sparse, individual shoots here and there. If it's SAV habitat, it is, considered what we're thinking of as a bed or a meadow here, regardless of density. So that's one thing. And we kept coming back to this example of, so say somebody wants to put in a dock and there's 3 shoots there. So what do we do with those 3 individual shoots of grass? Do we call that a bed? Do we call that a patch? Do we mitigate it for it? Do we not permit or allow that project to go through because of the presence of minimal SAV? But is that minimal SAV potential habitat for SAV later? Like, are those 3 shoots are they the beginning of a bed? So we kept kind of spinning around questions like that, which kind of led to maybe we just need to go with an ecological definition and let the regulatory agencies, base their decisions on that definition and not what we're perceiving as questions that they would need to answer. We did talk about, in addition to that, so we had a general conversation, and our intention was to go through each of these sub-bullets individually, and we didn't quite get there, but we addressed the edge of bed thing because with, like with monitoring and with our regulatory world, we need to know just where the bed is, right? So we got into the question of this definition having to do, if you're gauging whether it's going from, 5% or 20% to less than 5%, 3 shoots per meter squared, that implies that there is somebody in the water checking that. And so that again got into in our regulatory decision making, that is not always going to be feasible. So that was kind of limiting the conversation, I think, a little bit based on, it might be feasible in one state and not feasible in another state. So it was getting in the way a little bit of the fact that implied a water-based in situ survey. So then let's see, I'll go down to some of my notes here. So we talked about the presence of vegetation in 10 years. And so this gets to the question of how long we are considering presence or absence of SAV signifying habitat. I mentioned that in Chesapeake Bay, we use a 5-year rolling composite. And if SAV is present in any of those 5 years, those most recent 5 years of data, then that is SAV. That's an SAV bed, whether you get in the water and see it or not. That area is protected based on the previous presence within that 5 years. In North Carolina, they use 10 years. So better than 5. But again, that relies on the availability of monitoring data. So if we don't have monitoring data, we're having trouble defining a regulatory definition if we don't know what monitoring data is available. One of our members, our participants, was Ellie Bassett. She's a river keeper here in Chesapeake Bay. And she believed the more vague the definition, the better, because she suggested that in their fight with legislators and whatnot to protect SAV beds, the more defined you get, the more boxed in and more prescriptive you wind up making it. And it winds up being less protective. So like a really super defined bed might actually be counterproductive to what we're looking to do, which is protect SAV. Nina suggested that there are challenges in New Jersey. How many years can we go without SAV and justify protecting the habitat? So that goes back to the whole, is there monitoring data? Are we requiring in situ surveys for regulatory decision making? Judd mentioned, so Anne mentioned needing to, this underscores the need to update our maps. And then Judd suggested that using a historical maximum extent was great for defining a goal, but it was not counterproductive or maybe counterintuitive potentially, that even though, and we do this in Chesapeake Bay too, we have this historical maximum extent, our goal is based on that. But for some reason, that entire area is just, it's intuitive that entire area should just default be protected, right? But because SAV might not be in that area in the last 5 years or 10 years is not actually protected. So anyway, this was all lots of conversation into getting to helping with the definition, which I'll skip over some of this since I'm just starting to ramble on at this point. But Jill took a stab at, slimming things down, making a broad stroke definition, and she came up with an SAV meadow is defined as an area of the substrate that supports rooted, submerged vascular plants of any density or growth pattern. So disregarding patchiness, single shoots and patches greater than 30 meters apart are considered part of the same meadow, or less than 30 meters apart, sorry, are considered part of the same meadow if sediment, hydrology, and depth characteristics remain consistent and suitable between patches. So kind of have a little bit of a definition there. And then I'm not sure who put in the CEMP language for reference, but we've got that too. So anyway, does anybody from the regulatory group want to add anything? Phil, do you have any thoughts on it? Phil did not chastise me for not coming up with a definition in that 30-minute period or half an hour.
No, Brooke,
So
you did a good job.
okay, do you want to add anything? Did I miss any main points? You did say something about regional mapping that I didn't note, but that it should not be used for project level review.
Yeah, I mean, it is obvious to me that the regulatory process is very different geographically along the East Coast. In water or on water site specific surveys by applicants is almost routine in New England for projects. That's pro forma requirement in many cases, but it sounds like that's not being done elsewhere. We do have to deal with differences not only in the vegetation but also in the potential application of the regulatory process.
So do you do those in situ surveys because it's just more accurate at the, based on the timing, there's SAV there, or is it for lack of maps to reference?
No, we have maps.
Okay.
But again, we don't, and all the people creating those maps will tell you you can't rely on them for project level review.
Yeah.
And so we've made it pretty much standard that you need to at least go out and look site specifically. And again, that's on the applicant. That's not on the state or the feds to do that.
Okay. We do that to an extent. We use our, and like Anne suggested, we use our existing maps kind of for reference. And then if there's any question, sometimes we just let them use the maps. But then if there's a question or a need, we do occasionally require in situ surveys. So not heard of here. And then actually I wanted to mention that Jill brought up a really important point and good idea is to suggest looking at other habitat types for how they're defined. Suggesting that with wetland definitions or with, defining a river, a wetland delineation includes if there is any wetland plant present. And then the river includes, the area of max flooding. It's not just where the river is right then, it's the area, including the floodplain, essentially, I guess is what you're saying, Jill. So maybe that's part of what we need to look into as well. So Jesse was talking about additional research that needed to be done, but maybe we need to look into, using other habitats as examples for defining SAV beds.
And I want to clarify too that the finding other research wouldn't stop us from trying to come up with a definition. It would just maybe highlight key areas that we could highlight as like, this is where we're trying, but we also maybe aren't as certain about this point as others, or we can try to frame it in something like that.
Yeah, I think that's good. So what do you think, Jesse? You're down as leading the discussion.
Yes.
Are we, do we?
I was just.
This was our report out. Do we want to move into?
Yeah, let's move into the discussion part of it.
Okay.
Can you stop sharing your screen so I can see?
Yes. Yeah, that might help, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
thank
There
you.
you go.
All right, so I guess we can start with a discussion with the point that, well, I don't know how we want to start this because I feel like I'm just going to bring us back to like, do we want one definition or like multiple definitions or, so because I think the regulatory group brought up a good point about being over defined creates its own issues. So, I don't know, how do we, is there a way we think we could bring all this together? Like, what do you think, Z?
Well, so we had that discussion in our group as well about, what does that mean? Three different queries of, but it's one definition and then how you use it, you might need further information. And so my approach in our breakout room was this is like the scaffolding. Here's all the different components that can go into a meadow. So I almost envision, Jill came up with that great, like a short, succinct one definition. And if we're at a place where we like that, and it might be, if you're approaching this definition from a monitoring standpoint, here are some of the facets of what makes a bed that could be under consideration during your approach for monitoring. And that's where the bullet points that we can, and the numbers, because I there's definitely truth to the idea that if we give specific numbers, it could be used for things or against things. It depends on the usage. But if that's not included in the actual definition, but then for monitoring purposes, it's kind of helpful if we do have a general idea of what we're looking for. And that's where maybe that second level of that definition, not a new definition, but components of the definition that would be useful to highlight.
Well, why don't we, I feel like we all are pretty happy with we all edited the short intro paragraph a little bit differently, but we were all kind of happy. Like, I think my group, the ecology group, was happy with that part of our definition, like the short introductory part. Why don't we start with that? Like, do we think that, do we need to combine those, or Phil, you have your hand raised so we can. Oh, you're muted.
So here's the risk of having multiple definitions with multiple numbers. That becomes very problematic. And Judd brought up a point in our group, which I agree with wholeheartedly, having also been on a witness stand in my career. Stuff is going to be litigated, and the more prescriptive we can be, the more litigation proof it becomes. So I think there is value in having prescriptive definition in our group. And I thought even when we distilled our approach to just a simple definition, and I don't know if it was Jill's or someone else's, it's basically, the concept of any vegetation, period, of any density. And again, separating that out from the regulatory implications of that, because that's a separate decision. We talked about the 3 shoots. That's not a significant impact. So you could acknowledge that that's a meadow and still allow a project to go forward. And as I'm sorry, I forget who made the point, but you could require mitigation as a result of that, or some other compensation. So I think for best utility for a regulatory application is having this group come up with one definition that may universally apply to the other groups, but also has some prescriptive to it and is not entirely subjective.
Thank you, Phil. So when you say the one definition, is that, I guess maybe we could start with the one definition, like that one sort of header paragraph, whereas that was the text part of it, and agree on that text part and then get into the bullets. Because I feel like if we can get with that part, then that's at least something we can send out maybe.
If that was even all that we could do, just that, come up with a 1 or 2 sentence definition, and that's the lowest common denominator that everyone can agree to, I think there'd be value in that. And if we can't agree on the sub points, then, we can't agree on the sub points. That's fine. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I sounded like we were all close
Yeah.
on the text anyway, and I don't think it would be unreasonable to come up with a compromise that everyone can live with.
Yeah. So I think what we could do is definitely combine or like put all three on one sheet. And then maybe we could talk about we share that with the group, or we can maybe share that with steering committee and then see if there's ways to get those 3 paragraphs together. I don't think they're that far. We could even try to put them together in one and like send that out and see what people think and go from there. What do you think, Z? You just unmuted.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It kind of the low hanging fruit of this process is to pick that starter section. And that's something maybe the 3 of us can regroup, put that all together, and then send that out through the steering committee to start there with comments and feedback and get further thoughts on the phase 2 of this with all those other bullet points, the necessity, the use of it. But I think that's an easier lift, is to agree on a few sentences there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And then I suggested in my group that we were trying to come to consensus in a meeting yesterday on SAV mitigation and monitoring requirements. And what we did was essentially kind of what we're talking about now, filtering it down, condensing things, having maybe 1 or 2 options, and then having the members and the participants of the meeting just vote based on, green, I'm all in, yellow, I can live with this, but I might have some reservations, but I can live with it. And then red, just like absolutely not. And so if you have a majority of our membership here voting green or yellow, then we move it forward. Because when we were talking about this stuff yesterday, we've been talking about these things for years, and we were spinning in circles. And, with the definition thing, like defining a med, it's the same idea. We could just keep talking about it forever. And so I think coming up with that language, and then just voting on it might be, after we edit it and give everybody an opportunity to edit, of course, or comment, then just moving it forward for a vote for consensus. I think that would finally get us there, hopefully.
All right. So what it sounds like we're planning to do is to get to combine the sentence, the text part into like a one definition, and then maybe we'll send that around. But then we'll also, as a second part, look at how we within the bullet points, the different groups broke those out. Maybe try to find either like put those together, and we can even work like bullet point by bullet point or moving forward with that. But the first thing, it sounds like we are actually closer than I thought we might be to the initial text sentence. So that could be good. Sorry. There's stuff going on.
Yeah, just putting in the chat from, if you vote red, you volunteer to help figure out a solution, which was the rule of thumb. You can disagree all you want, but then help arrive at an alternative. And then, similar point is that if it's going red in one direction, that seems to be all regulatory folks or all, ecological folks, then that's something that can be teased apart if that's what ends up happening.
We could have that in the vote. It could be like different colors, and then sort of like, yeah, what of the 3 do you have an issue with? Like what perspective? Yeah. Okay.
So are we coming to terms with one definition instead of 3? Are we there for one definition? Is that?
I think it sounds like it'd be the most helpful, but what are your thoughts in the group?
The group, thumbs up, thumbs down.
Do we want to use a react? I think
I see thumbs up.
Yeah.
Yep.
Is thumbs down even an option? No. The crying, well, that's a laughing face. The surprised face, if you don't like it.
Oh, there's
it's kind of nice that Zoom wants you always to be, you found angry.
Oh yeah. You just have to expand it. There's lots of reactions down there.
I've never expanded mine to include negative ones, Brooke. What's going on over there?
There you go.
All right, but there are a couple of unhappy faces.
Yeah.
So those folks with the crying faces, what are your thoughts on this? Like, what would you like to see instead of the one you saw? You could give us some more insight.
Did you get unhappy faces?
I thought I saw a crying one.
Face. I was a crying face, but huh, I don't know. I'm so torn. I like the idea of making a prescriptive definition, like Phil said, but I also really get the idea of making it vague. The problem is, if you say, you want your meadow, it's defined as a meadow if it serves the ecological functions of a meadow, like, buffering the shoreline, provision of habitat, then you're going to get people trying to prove or disprove that. And so there's an area of litigation right there. And what is provision of habitat? Like, oh, I saw one fish or I didn't see a fish. So then I'm thinking anytime there's a plant, and if it's like Jill said, if it's a consistent substrate, but that's not the right definition for some kinds of scientific work that you'd be doing or mapping. So I don't know, I kind of go back to like a regulatory definition might be less prescriptive than some other more tailored definitions, but I don't know, maybe you want that. Maybe you want the numbers. I added the less than 30 meters apart. We could easily take it out. It was just because the idea of like, well, is that one meadow or is it two? Like two, you want two polygons there or just one? Well, if it's separated by 30 meters, then maybe you'd have two. But that seemed important to me when I was thinking about it.
I just didn't know if that came from like a literature or like a sort of like an just your knowledge, right? Like your knowledge base. If it was more of like, there's a study, that's all.
No, that's the guideline that we use when we're doing the mapping. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Thank you. Yeah, so I figured there's a reason. Just wanted to make sure.
It might be, Phil was talking about the reproductive potential distance, or how far the seeds might travel, being how far we base the bed patches, or how far apart patches could be.
That would vary with species.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Becky, you have your hand up.
Yeah. I think Kayla and I were posting in the chat earlier that I think just on the 3 versus 1 definitions thing, I think having one core definition is, I think that would be good, but I think that it would solve the problem and we would need to include suggested guidance for the application of that definition for the 3 purposes. And that's, again, making it a more complex document. But I think she suggested a flowchart situation. And I think if there's a very simple, maybe vague definition that is then routed to the regulatory branch of the flowchart with more detailed suggested interpretation, and then like for the scientific thing and then for the monitoring thing. I wanted to make sure that people noticed that suggestion.
Thank you. Anne?
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to add that looking at the JC suggestion, whatever it is, it does need to be vague enough to fit all of the states that are going to be using this. And so it kind of varies from the north to the south. So just have to keep that in mind. Like I'm thinking 30 meters apart, less than 30 meters apart is part of the same meadow. From a regulatory standpoint, that's 90 feet. You could, slide a dock in over through, between those patches. But if you're saying it's one patch, you'd be taking the whole area in. So I was kind of worried about how that would work out. And then I was just going to add one thing that came up about the North Carolina definition, which is one reason it was being discussed to edit that, change it, is that our water quality folks pointed out that if your definition includes and has appropriate environmental characteristics like water quality, that can actually be used against you. So then the people can say, they'll say, okay, it's not going to support SAV, so it's no longer SAV habitat. And they were also brought up, that's not how it works for shellfish waters. If it's shellfish waters, they were determined to be shellfish waters because they had shellfish at one time. They don't have to have shellfish. They stay as shellfish waters. And what that does is if the shellfish is gone, say as an example, that then triggers it on the list of impaired waters to get more improvements done. So you could backfire on them. I guess they were concerned that the 10 years, if it's gone after 10 years and it's not SAV habitat, and then that excludes restoration from being done. If that makes sense, water quality restoration. So I'm just throwing that in there for thoughts for your, to keep in mind.
Before Phil, I think Tay had a response maybe into one of your points.
I can't remember right now. Sorry.
Okay, I think it's about the doc, but that's okay. All right. Thank you. And Phil, your hand's up next.
Yeah. So, kind of building off of what Ann was saying. So I think, we've used the dock example a lot here. There are two regulatory pathways here. One is 404, the Wetlands Protection Act under that section of the Clean Water Act, which a lot of this applies to. But the other thing that she just brought up and I mentioned earlier is the water quality standards part of the Clean Water Act, which is existing uses. And the point Ann was making was, there was shellfish there once, it's shellfish habitat going forward. The same is true of SAV under federal law, under, Clean Water Act jurisdiction. As I mentioned in the very beginning, from the passage of the Clean Water Act, if you have mapped SAV in a specific location, that is considered an existing use. Now, that's not applied the same way under the Wetlands Protection Act. So if you're building a dock, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't build a dock because there was SAV there in 73. But it does mean that if the SAV is not there, that area can be put on the impaired waters list and requiring the state to come up with reasons why the SAV is not there and potentially leading to a TMDL, which is looking at allocation of waste loads, most likely nitrogen or phosphorus in this case. So there are implications above and beyond the Wetland Protection Act for this definition. And I hope we don't lose sight of that because it's more than just about docks.
Thanks, Phil. It's good points for sure. It seems to me that when we're trying to come up with this definition and trying to fit all three together, that really, and I think it's kind of going to something that Joel Fodry said in our group, is when we're doing the ecological stuff and we're writing papers or writing, trying to describe it, we just pick what we want to focus on. Does it really need to be, do we need to, maybe we could, if the group is okay, we can try to lean more towards wordsmithing it so it fits best for regulatory and monitoring, keeping in mind that we want to have the ecological functions. That's the whole reason we want to keep these meadows there. But if the wordsmithing more leans that way, since the ecologists are going to define it the way they want to define it. But there's a lot of there's implications of how we define it for regulatory and monitoring. So maybe we can kind of keep it in mind. We're trying to, is the ecology is why we're doing this, but then the details can be more towards the other two definitions. Take that approach.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I think that's the only way to move forward if we're talking all species of SAV and across all the states. I think that's really wise.
Yeah.
Well, so somebody just called me wise. We're moving on. We're not having any more discussion at this point. And actually this is one of my, so first off, thank you all so much for these conversations. These are, all the groups, it was really super interesting. So I'm excited that we're going to continue. And this is a topic that I think so many of us have had so many conversations about. So it's kind of nice to see potentially moving forward, which should be good. But we're getting to my favorite part of these meetings, which is when everybody gives an update on what they're doing and what they're excited about. So if there's no other comments, I'll leave it open for like final comments on the definitions, and then we'll move into partner updates. All right. So any updates? What are y'all up to?
I can certainly lead this charge because it's a bit bittersweet for me. So I'm going to actually be leaving the East Coast SAV region. My co-collaborators here, Brooke and Jesse, have assured me I still get to be involved, but I have taken a position as a science team lead with Project Seagrass, and I'll be based in Scotland. So it would be an extent of the imagination to include Scotland on the East Coast of North America. So wanted to put that out there and really appreciate everything Jesse and Brooke and I have accomplished here. And I do plan to still be involved, but in a diminished capacity given the 5-hour time difference.
Congratulations. Very exciting.
Yes, we're all so happy for you.
Project Seagrass is lucky to have you.
Yes. And we're all really excited to have a place to come and visit in Edinburgh.
This is true.
Any other awesome updates? Becky, yeah.
Yeah, so within the NERS system, the SAV work group is currently putting together a proposal for a science collaborative catalyst project with the intention of compiling and harmonizing the NERS collected SAV data from the past, however long, whatever's available. There has not been a super duper clear system-wide protocol thus far about how to collect our long-term SAV data. So there's some little variations here, there, and everywhere. And so the goal of this is to bring it all together and harmonize it, make the data sets talk to each other, and do a mini analysis of some really robust data sets so that we can pull out lessons to inform that final system-wide protocol for consistency. And that sets the stage for the next big project that will be a nationwide synthesis of NERS SAV data. And we'll figure that out when we get there. But we are excited, and I was going to potentially ask this group for a letter of support, potentially, if that is something that you feel like would benefit this group or like the SAV world at large. So yeah, Jamie's involved in that, and some others on here. I haven't seen the list of who's here today, so thought I'd let you all know.
Awesome.
That's awesome, Becky.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Becky.
very cool. Kayla.
I just figured I would shout out some efforts coming out of the first state here in Delaware. And I see my counterpart here, Taylor, is on from the Center for Inland Bays. So we are ramping up some of the efforts. If you don't know, we started a Delaware specific SAV working group last year. And we've been meeting throughout the year to get stuff done. One of the things that we are kind of working on, I'm spearheading with Taylor and Brittany Haywood from Delaware Sea Grant, is root restoration and a, turbulator, kind of copy pasting what Maryland efforts are doing. So we are ramping those up again, and actually DENREC is establishing a SAV facility down in Lewis. So we're going to have a designated shed and storage area and some tanks and turbulator 2.0 build out. So, ramping up restoration, and Taylor spearheads more of the habitat suitability within the inland bays. And we're looking to kind of expand that across the state with our work group members. And another big update is this year we're planning to roll out our volunteer SAV monitoring efforts, which is mirroring the SAV watchers that is out of the Chesapeake Bay program. We've been tailoring a specific monitoring to be a little bit more applicable for Delaware. Even if we are neighbors to Maryland, we just are a little different. So we're going to have a Delaware specific monitoring protocol that it will be used by both like scientific communities and volunteers. So we're looking forward to doing that. And those are some of our big updates.
Awesome. Thank you. It's really exciting to hear what's going on in Delaware. Brooker, oh, sorry. Katie.
Hi, everyone. We at our Connecticut Reserve facilitate the Long Island Sound Eelgrass Collaborative. And we, at our last meeting, announced the release. For some reason, my camera's not turning on. There we go. We announced the release of a new white paper that we've been putting together since last summer that focuses on New York and Connecticut seed transport guidance. So it focuses on moving seed within Long Island Sound and also bringing seed from the south shore of Long Island into Long Island Sound waters. And so I'm going to put a link in the chat so people can go and find it there from our Long Island Sound Eelgrass Collaborative's website. One of the things that emerged through that exercise of, emailing and talking to state agency staff and also talking to restoration practitioners about the need for this kind of guidance is also the need to develop a set of best management practices for moving seed, both within Long Island Sound and from outside Long Island Sound, especially from outside of the Sound, because agencies are particularly concerned about bringing seed in from external, sources. So the next effort of our Long Island Sound Eelgrass Collaborative's meeting, which is going to be focused on this best management practice topic, is going to be March 11th. And you can register for that if you're interested in hearing more. Steve Schott from the Cortinell Cooperative Extension is going to lead that discussion, and he's been collaborating with other researchers on that topic to draft a set of best management practices. And so that's going to be a big focus of ours on our March 11th meeting. So feel free to go to that site that I put in the chat, and you can learn a little bit more about our collaborative and our next upcoming meeting.
Awesome. Thank you. That sounds awesome. I'm really excited to read about the seed transport stuff for sure. That's been a really key topic, so that's exciting. Thank you. Yep. That someone else. I want to do a quick plug for AIRS. The next AIRS meeting is in Lewis, Delaware, March 13th through the 15th. Abstract just closed yesterday, but you can still come and see lots and lots of amazing talks. And if there's enough of us there, I'm sure we can manage to have some time to chat all things SAV. So please come to the AIRS meeting. I will put the meeting part of the webpage in the chat. So yeah, Jill.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to quickly introduce myself because I'm new here. I'm Jill Tepizza. I work for Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, or SCWRP, and my whole team did want to be here today, but I was the only person with this time block available. So I just wanted to say that we're also working on a white paper over on the West Coast, led by Ocean Protection Council, looking at habitat mapping specifically for eelgrass, coastal wetlands, and a few other coastal habitats. But thank you guys so much for an invigorating discussion today.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
California.
Yeah.
We are expanding. Maybe Scotland's in. I'm just saying.
At least you're in the right ocean.
Can I ask how you heard about the East Coast Collaborative over on the West Coast?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Actually, my department head, Eric Stein, I think he's pretty well connected in the SAV area. He just sort of pointed out that this was happening. I have no idea how it came across his radar. And because I'm starting up, I'm actually pretty new there, and I'm looking to get into some SAV projects, he recommended that I attend.
Yeah, great. That's awesome. Thanks.
Welcome. Yeah, for sure. I don't have any other hands raised right now. Phil, you want to do your final plug for Zastropalooza?
Sure. So Jill, since you're new, and others. And I know a lot of you I've emailed, and I'm still waiting to hear back from some of you. I'm not nagging or anything, but Zostropalooza this year is actually a 2-day event, March 26th and 27th. It's a hybrid event. Some great talks in flowering phenology, restoration from actually our speakers will be speaking. First speaker will be in Germany at the time, and we have speakers from the West Coast as well. So we're covering quite a disparate time zones on day one. And then day two is going to be more of a focused discussion on thermal resilience. So the first half will be discussions with people who have documented or experienced, seen, thermal stress or thermal decline in Zostra. And then the second half is going to be people who are doing experiments on thermal resilience. And there's a number of people in this group that I know are doing that already. But on the first one, we actually have someone from Ireland who has seen thermal stress on that shoreline. And so it'll be really interesting to hear people's experiences and get a scope of the problem. It's not just, the southern end of the range on the Atlantic coast. Apparently, it's much more widespread. So people should reach out to me, and I can connect you, send you the remote access link in advance of the meeting. And this is the 34th annual. Next year will be 35, and on those years that end in 0 or 5s, I tend to give away swag. So you may want to make the effort to actually make it to Boston next year. So start saving your pennies. And Z, please make sure that you send me your new contact information so that we can stay in touch and maybe have you present next year from Scotland.
Great. Thanks, Phil.
Awesome. Very cool. I would love to get Zostropalooza swag. Oh my god. Tay, you're next.
So we talked a lot about regulatory, obviously, what's the regulatory definition of a seagrass bed? And I was wondering if if it's not a heavy lift, people who have their finger on their state's regulatory language for protection of SAV, if you could clip it and send it to me. I'm really curious what other states have for protections of SAV. I can share what Massachusetts has in the Wetlands Protection Act regs. And yeah, I think that would be really interesting, because one of our issues is we don't have a definition of bed, but it's in the word bed is in our regs.
So don't forget that we do have that regulatory database on our website that it was originally compiled for Chesapeake Bay. And then we just took the Excel file essentially and added, our members added their definitions over the last year. So there's a lot in there. Yeah. I'll go ahead and find that and I'll put it in the chat.
Thanks for that reminder.
Yeah.
Anybody else in this who want to plug or be proud of? I hesitate to ask, but hope everybody's doing all right this week. Doing okay as best we can. And for our federal friends, I just want to say we're thinking about you, and if there's anything we can do to help, besides call our local Congress people, let us know. But been a fun week.
Yeah, we just got an interesting memo last night about the proposed, buyout or whatever you want to call it, severance package, and how you could use those 9 months to go on that vacation you've always been wanting to take. It's like, oh my God, it can't get any more offensive. But yeah, I think it's actually having the opposite effect of what they hope. Is like most people are doubling down and saying, we're not going anywhere.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, definitely good.
You're not going to get paid out anyway. It's all lies. He has no authority to do that.
I heard that one too. Don't take it because you may not get that.
No.
Well, there's no money for a federal budget after March 14th, so I don't know how they could promise anything anyway. So,
Well, any other updates or things that folks are doing? Yeah, Susan.
I can just give you a 2-second one. We're looking toward restoration in the Cohasset area and looking forward to learning more about doing that with seeds. And hopefully we'll have more things to share on that next time we meet.
Awesome. That's awesome. Really exciting. Very cool.
Jesse, I'll add that, I mentioned a couple times that yesterday the SAV work group in Chesapeake Bay met we combined our SAV experts with our regulatory agencies and a few other folks that are involved in SAV mitigation practice, either, for dredge projects, living shoreline projects, whatever. They're doing actual SAV restoration using seeds. And the purpose of it was to assemble a guidance document for the regulatory agencies to use when requiring SAV mitigation, and then the follow-up monitoring, and then gauging success and what those success criteria look like. Since we're just kind of ramping up on SAV mitigation requirements, it's all been done on a case-by-case basis so far, and our regulatory agencies were really just looking for concrete guidance. And so we will have a document out, it'll be specific to Chesapeake Bay, but I'll make sure to put it on our East Coast Collaborative website when it's complete for, any of the rest of you all to use or steal snippets from, or, just use as reference for your own purposes in your states. So that'll be out in a couple months, as soon as I get to it, as the compiling of information. So another resource hopefully available soon.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool. Jill asked about in the chat, there's the genome project that's a few of us are involved on. We have collected eelgrass samples from North Carolina to Maine. I can't remember the exact numbers. Sorry, Jill, I need to get that off the top of my head. But we do, we have samples from, I think, all the states in between. But if anybody, so what we're currently doing is those have been processed or being sent off, and we're analyzing genomes, and the hope is to be able to kind of put that out there for folks to use as reference, and we'll have all the population data, like where they came from and that sort of thing. But there's always huge gap. It's always just one or two, maybe like 10 populations per state. So definitely not, it's a bigger coverage than we currently have, but it's, it's always gonna be added more. So we are still in the early days of that, and we're currently been thrown for a loop with all the funding stuff. So we were hoping to start using that information to inform some climate resilient pilot restoration projects this year, and that's still the plan. But we will see, because Park Service money we don't know. So we're in a little bit of limbo, but we do have that has been collected, that has been processed. So we will be able to get that out, and we're hoping to share that with folks as soon as we can. But I'll continue to update you as we move forward. Yeah. Very cool. Thanks for asking, Jill. Anybody else? Awesome. Well, you've given us 3 hours of a Friday, and I am extremely appreciative of that. So thank you all very, very much. And we will send out a consolidated definition to our steering committee members with our sort of tiered how you answer. Jed, were you going to say something?
No.
No. Okay. Sorry. And then we will send that out to folks, and then we'll give you more information with next steps after that. But thank you all very much.
Yeah, thanks for all your hard work, you guys, putting this together. Good luck, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Jed.
Stay in
We're all
touch.
very excited.
Gonna miss
She's
you.
not leaving the collaborative.
We're expanding it.
Yeah, transatlantic collaborative now.
Yeah, Florida's going to want in sooner or later.
Don't tell Brad.
All right. I know. All right. Thank
Bye,
you,
y'all.
everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.